My name is Nadia. I grew up the kind of girl who pressed flowers between book pages and dreamed of a wedding day where my mother would cry the good kind of tears, the kind that say, "I'm so proud of you," not the kind that say, "Why didn't you listen to me?" I had two parents who poured everything they had into raising me in a house that was small in square footage and enormous in everything else. My father was a retired school principal with soft hands and a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest before it ever reached his face. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of every student he'd ever taught, who kept a handwritten journal he never showed anyone, who cried exactly twice that I witnessed, once at my grandmother's funeral and once at my college graduation, in that order. My mother was a woman who ironed tablecloths at midnight, who made 3 versions of every dish until she found the right one, who believed with her whole heart that presentation was just another word for love. They were not wealthy people. They were something better than wealthy. They were deliberate. I carried them with me into every room I ever entered. Their work ethic, their quiet dignity, the way they made something out of very little without ever making you feel the effort. When I left for university at 18, my mother packed my bags with things I didn't ask for: a small framed photo of the three of us, a jar of her homemade pickle, a note written on the back of a grocery list that said simply, "You are more ready than you know." I kept that note in my wallet for years. I still have it. When I met Daniel Hargrove at 26, I thought I had found someone who understood that kind of love, the kind that is built quietly, with consistency and intention, without needing an audience. He was charming in the way that feels solid rather than slippery. He remembered small details. He showed up on time. He laughed at my father's terrible jokes with the kind of genuine delight that cannot be faked, and he ate my mother's cooking and complimented it like he meant every word, and for 2 years everything felt like the right kind of right. I was not naive about him. I knew his edges. He could be avoidant when things got difficult. He preferred resolution to confrontation, which sometimes meant he let uncomfortable things linger rather than address them directly. I told myself these were manageable things. I told myself every person comes with something to work around. Then came the engagement. And with it, his family, fully, loudly, and all at once. The Hargroves were not a bad family in any dramatic sense. There was no obvious villain, no moment of open cruelty I could point to in those early months. What they were, precisely, was certain. Certain that their traditions were the right traditions, that their preferences were simply good taste, that their way of doing things had been correct long enough to no longer require debate. Daniel's mother, Carolyn, had the kind of presence that arrives in a room before she does, not through warmth, but through the sheer force of her organizational confidence. She had opinions about everything and delivered them as though they were results of research rather than preference. His sister Brooke was her mother's shadow and her mother's megaphone at the same time, the kind of woman who enforces decisions she did not technically make. His father Gerald said very little, but his silence somehow always ended up counting as the deciding vote. The wedding planning began as a conversation and ended as a takeover. It happened so gradually, I almost didn't see it. A suggestion from my mother acknowledged and then quietly not acted on. A venue option my parents preferred that was described as lovely but ultimately passed over. A planning meeting I wasn't told about until it had already happened. Carolyn was never rude to my face. That was the thing that made it so hard to name. She smiled, she included me in the email chains, she used my name warmly. But the actual decisions happened in spaces I was not invited into, and the outcome of every decision reflected one family's preferences at the total expense of the others. My mother noticed before I was willing to. She mentioned it once, in the careful way she mentioned things that hurt her, lightly, almost offhandedly, as though the lightness might protect both of us from what the weight of it actually was. I brushed it off. I told myself I was busy, that I was happy, that all families merging feel like two weather systems learning to share the same sky. The week before the wedding, my father called me in the evening. He spoke quietly, without drama, without accusation. He said, "Nadia, Beta, we don't know where we're sitting. Carolyn gave us a table number, but when your mother checked, the table had already been reassigned. We're not on the seating chart. I told him it was a mistake. A clerical error, an oversight, something easily fixed. I believed it, or I told myself I did. But somewhere beneath that reassurance, something in me had already gone very still, the way the air goes still before a storm that has been building for a long time finally decides to arrive. My wedding day was a Saturday in late October. The vineyard sat about 40 minutes outside the city, tucked behind a long gravel road lined with oak trees that had gone amber and rust at the edges, their leaves catching the afternoon light like something out of a painting I had loved as a child. My mother kept a print above our fireplace when I was growing up, a countryside scene, golden and still, the kind of image that makes you feel safe just looking at it. When I first visited the venue with Daniel, she had walked through the front gate and stopped, and I watched her face do something soft and private, and she turned to me and said, "This is beautiful, Nadia." And that was the moment I knew we had found the right place. I wanted to give her that. I wanted her to spend my wedding day inside something that felt like the painting she had looked at her whole life. She deserved that. She had earned far more than that. I arrived in a separate car with my bridesmaids, the way these things are arranged, which meant I was insulated from the entrance for the first hour. I was in a side room having my veil pinned and my lipstick checked, and my hand held by my best friend Priya, who kept saying, "You look unreal," in a way that made me feel, for those brief minutes, like everything was exactly as it should be. I did not know what was happening outside that door. I did not know what my parents were experiencing while I sat in that warm room with good lighting and a glass of Prosecco I was too nervous to finish. My parents had arrived early. This was never a question. It was simply who they were. Early was their form of respect, their way of saying, "We take this seriously. We take you seriously." My mother had ordered her outfit 3 months before the wedding, a deep teal salwar kameez with delicate gold embroidery at the cuffs and hem. She had shown it to me over a video call, holding it up against herself in the bedroom mirror, asking if it was right, and I had told her it was more than right. It was perfect. My father wore a charcoal suit he'd had dry cleaned twice in the 2 weeks leading up to the day. He had also, I found out later, bought new dress shoes, his first pair in 11 years, because he wanted to look worthy of the occasion. That detail, when I heard it, did something to me I still haven't fully put into words. They arrived, dressed and ready and early, and they stood near the entrance of the vineyard and waited to be shown to their seats. Specifically, to the front row seats that had been designated for the bride's parents at every planning meeting, confirmed verbally by Carolyn herself at the final walkthrough 6 weeks prior. The seats that had little cards. The seats that were theirs. No one came. The wedding coordinator, a woman named Tess, who I had assumed was a neutral professional but who turned out to be Brooke's college roommate, placed in the role by Carolyn sometime after our original coordinator had a scheduling conflict, moved through the arriving guests with efficiency and warmth. She walked Daniel's relatives to their seats with a smile and a gentle hand gesture. She greeted the Hargrove extended family by name. She passed my parents 3 times. Not once did she stop. Not once did she ask if they needed help. My mother said afterward that they assumed at first it was simply the busyness of the hour, that someone would come, that it was all being managed. My father waited with his hands folded in front of him, patient in the particular way of a man who has spent decades not making his discomfort anyone else's problem. Eventually, my mother approached Tess herself and explained who they were. Tess smiled. That specific smile, my mother described it to me later, that is all teeth and no warmth, and said there was a small seating issue being sorted out and she would get back to them in just a moment. My parents waited another 20 minutes near the entrance while every other guest was seated around them. When Tess finally returned, she walked them to table 14, near the back of the hall, adjacent to the catering entrance. Between 2 of Daniel's college acquaintances and a couple my parents had never met and would never see again, there were no name cards at the table. There was no label. They sat down because they had no other choice, and because they are the kind of people who do not create scenes at their daughter's wedding, no matter what is being done to them. The front row chairs that had been designated for them. I confirmed this afterward, methodically, the way you confirm something you already know and wish you didn't, had been quietly rearranged that same morning. 4 additional seats had been added to the Hargrove family section to accommodate aunts and cousins who had not originally been given front row placement. My parents' reserved spots had simply been absorbed, folded into someone else's arrangement, erased without announcement or apology or, apparently, a second thought. I learned all of this during cocktail hour. My cousin Reshma found me near the terrace and pulled me gently to one side. She told me carefully, watching my face the whole time, the way you tell someone something you've been carrying for hours and don't know how they'll receive. I remember the sensation of listening, not quite grief, not quite fury, something underneath both of them, something cold and absolutely clear, like water that has been still for a very long time. I looked across the terrace at my parents. My mother was holding a glass of water, smiling the particular smile she reserves for when she is holding something difficult, very still inside herself. My father had his hands resting on his knees and was watching the vineyard lights begin to come on in the distance, quiet and unbothered in the way only a person with enormous self-possession can be unbothered. They had not told me. They would not have told me. They had come here for my happiness, and they were protecting it even now, even from this corner table by the kitchen, even in their new shoes and their carefully chosen clothes and their 12 hours of travel to be here. I made a decision in that moment. I did not cry. I did not find Daniel immediately. I simply stood very still on that terrace in the October air and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something with direction and purpose. A decision, fully formed, that before this night was over, something true was going to be said out loud in that room. I did not know yet exactly how. I only knew it was no longer optional. I found Daniel near the bar at the far end of the cocktail terrace, laughing with Brooke and 2 of his fraternity brothers whose names I could never keep straight. He had loosened his tie slightly, the way he always did when he relaxed into an evening, and his cheeks were flushed from the champagne and the cold October air and the particular joy of a man who believes his wedding day is going exactly as planned. He looked handsome. He looked happy. When he saw me walking toward him through the crowd, he smiled the smile I had fallen in love with, open and easy and completely unguarded, and he reached out his hand for mine. I almost let it go. I need to be honest about that, because it matters. I almost took his hand and stepped into that smile and let the evening carry us forward. The venue was golden. The music was warm. 300 people were drinking and laughing, and the hard part of the day, the ceremony, the nerves, the vows said out loud in front of everyone you know, was behind us. There was a version of that moment where I chose the path of least resistance, where I told myself I would deal with it later, after the honeymoon, after the dust settled, after some undefined future point when the conversation would be easier. I had walked that path before. I was very practiced at it. I could have found it in the dark. Instead, I touched Daniel's arm and asked him to step away from the group for a moment. He excused himself with the easy confidence of a man who has no idea what is coming. We moved to a quieter spot near the edge of the terrace, where the string lights ended and the vineyard opened up into darkness, and I told him what had happened to my parents. I told him plainly. No dramatics, no trembling voice. I told him they had arrived early and been left standing at the entrance. I told him they had been walked to a table near the kitchen after waiting nearly half an hour. I told him their front row seats had been given away that morning to Hargrove relatives without anyone notifying me or them or making any attempt at an alternative arrangement. I told him all of it in the same steady tone you use when you have already passed through the shaking part and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. His face did something I was not prepared for. Not surprise. That was what I had expected and what I was braced for. What happened instead was a pause, a fraction of a second, barely visible, where his expression simply held still before rearranging itself into something that was performing concern. In that half second, before the performance began, I saw the thing I had been not seeing for months. He had known. Not every detail, perhaps not the specific mechanics of how the seating chart had been altered or the exact conversation between Carolyn and Tess, but he had known his mother's tendencies and chosen not to look too closely. He had known Brooke was embedded in the coordination and decided it was easier not to ask questions. He had created, through deliberate inattention, the conditions for exactly this to happen, and then positioned himself far enough from the details that he could later claim he hadn't known. He said his mother had only wanted the family section to feel like family. He said it gently, with the careful tone of a man offering a reasonable explanation rather than a justification. He said my parents had been included. They were there, they were seated, they were part of the day. I said, "They were put near the kitchen, Daniel." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said the thing that cost him more than he understood at the time. He said, "It's one day. Can we please not do this today?" Not, "I didn't know, let me fix it." Not, "That shouldn't have happened, I'm sorry." What he said was, "Can we not do this?" As though my parents' dignity were a disruption. As though the appropriate response to what had been done to them was my continued silence, gift-wrapped as maturity. I had heard variations of that sentence my entire relationship with him, delivered in different registers, for different occasions, but always carrying the same instruction underneath. Your discomfort is inconvenient. Please manage it quietly. I had managed it quietly many times. I had folded it away and called the folding patience, and called the patience love, and told myself that was simply how adults navigated difficult families. I had been doing it so long I had almost stopped recognizing it as a choice. Standing there at the edge of the terrace with the vineyard dark behind us and the party bright ahead of us, I recognized it very clearly as a choice, and I recognized with equal clarity that I was no longer willing to make it. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing to raise. What I felt was not hot or ragged. It was precise, like something that has been sharpened over a long time and finally brought to its actual purpose. I looked at my husband on our wedding day and I told him that I was going to speak at the reception. That I was going to say something that needed to be said. That he could stand beside me when I said it, or he could stand somewhere else, but that this particular decision was not one I was asking his permission for. He said my name. Once in a normal voice, once in the lower register that I recognized, the one that meant, "Please don't embarrass me in front of my family." He reached for my hand. His expression had shifted from performed concern into something closer to genuine alarm, and I understood that the alarm was not about my parents. It was about the room, about Carolyn's face, about what the Hargrove side of the guest list might think and say and remember. I understood it. I simply no longer cared about it more than I cared about the truth. I turned and walked toward the reception hall. I heard him follow me a few steps behind. That he followed, that he did not stay at the bar and let me walk in alone, was the thing I held on to in the weeks afterward when everything got harder before it got better. It was not enough, not even close to enough, but it was something. It was the small proof that somewhere underneath the avoidance and the people-pleasing and the years of choosing his mother's comfort over my parents' dignity, there was a man who, when the moment finally arrived and could not be postponed any longer, chose to show up. Late, uncertain, slightly pale, but present. I did not look back to check if he was still there. I kept walking forward into the warm light of the hall, toward the microphone stand at the front of the room, toward the thing I should have done, I understand now, long before that night. The reception hall was everything the planning had promised it would be. 300 candles at varying heights running the length of every table, eucalyptus and white ranunculus trailing down the centers, the kind of floral arrangements that look effortless and cost a month's rent. The ceiling had been strung with warm Edison bulbs that cast everything in amber, and the whole room had that quality of light that makes people look like the best versions of themselves, softer, happier, more beautiful than ordinary Tuesday life allows. It was genuinely stunning. I had stood in this room during the walkthrough 6 weeks earlier and felt something close to disbelief that it would actually look this way on the night. Standing in it now, with the candles lit and the guests seated and the low hum of 300 people in good spirits filling the air, it looked even better than I had imagined. I noticed none of it. Not really. I was moving through it the way you move through a place when your body is present and your mind is already somewhere slightly ahead, rehearsing. The best man had just finished his toast. It had been exactly what a best man toast should be. Funny without being cruel, sentimental without being maudlin, the kind of speech that earns its laugh and then earns its silence and sits down at the right moment. People were still smiling from it. Glasses were being refilled. The DJ, a young man with careful headphones and good instincts, was cueing up the introduction to the first dance, his hand resting on the fader, watching the room for the signal. I walked to the front before he could bring the music in. He saw me coming. Something in my posture or my expression or the simple fact of the bride walking toward the microphone stand with intention must have communicated itself clearly, because he lifted his hand from the fader and let the music fade out without being asked. The room noticed the absence of sound before it noticed me. Heads turned. Conversations tapered. 300 people shifted their attention toward the front of the hall in the way that crowds do when something unscheduled is about to happen and they cannot yet tell whether it will be wonderful or alarming. I took the microphone from the stand. I was aware of Carolyn in my peripheral vision, front table, center seat, the place of honor she had arranged for herself with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. Her smile had changed. It was the careful version now, the one she wore when she was waiting to assess a situation before deciding how to respond to it. Brooke was beside her, and Brooke's expression had gone very still in the way that meant she was already calculating. Daniel was a half step behind me and slightly to my left, close enough that in any photograph taken at that moment he would appear to be standing by my side, which I noted and said nothing about. I looked out at the room. All that candlelight, all those faces turned toward me, Daniel's colleagues and university friends, Hargrove relatives spanning 3 generations, my own small contingent of family and friends who had flown in and driven long distances and taken days off work to be here. And at the back, near the catering doors, at a table without name cards, my parents. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. She was sitting very straight, the way she always sat when she was in a room where she was trying to take up exactly the right amount of space and no more. My father looked up from whatever quiet thought he had been sitting with and found my eyes across the full length of that hall, through all the candlelight and the watching faces, and he did the thing he has done my entire life. A slight tilt of his head, barely perceptible, that has always meant, I'm here. Whatever you need. I'm with you. I brought the microphone up and I spoke. I told the room that before the first dance began, I needed to do something I should have done much earlier, not just that evening, but in the months leading up to it. I needed to recognize, properly and out loud and in front of everyone gathered, the 2 people without whom none of what they were looking at would exist. Not the venue, not the flowers, not the dress, and not the woman standing at the front of the room holding a microphone on the best and most clarifying day of her life. I talked about my father first. I told them about the extra shifts he worked when I was 16 so I could join my school trip to Italy, a country he himself had never visited and still hasn't. I told them he had stood at the departure gate and waved until I was entirely out of sight, and that my mother told me later he had stayed in the car in the airport parking lot for 20 minutes afterward because he needed a moment before he could drive. I told them he had attended every single parent-teacher conference of my academic life, that he had read every essay I ever wrote before I submitted it, that he had written me a letter when I graduated university that I have read so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. Then I talked about my mother. I told them she had sat with me on the bathroom floor the night before my university entrance exam, not to quiz me, not to coach me, simply to sit. She had brought 2 cups of tea and a small plate of biscuits, and she had stayed there on the cold tiles beside me for 2 hours because she understood, without being told, that what I needed was not advice, but company. I told them she had done 10,000 things like that across my entire life. Quietly, without annotation, without requiring acknowledgement. I told them the embroidery on the cuffs of her outfit tonight had taken her 3 weeks to choose, because she wanted to look worthy of her daughter's wedding day, and that detail alone said everything about who she was. I paused. The room had gone the kind of quiet that feels different from ordinary quiet, fuller somehow, more deliberate, as though everyone in it had made a small, private decision to hold still. I looked directly at my parents and I said, "I'm sorry you are not seated where you deserve to be seated today. That was wrong. And I am sorry I did not protect you from it the way you have spent your entire lives protecting me from everything you could. This is me doing it late, but I am doing it." Then I turned to the front row. I asked, and I want to be precise about this because it matters how it was done. I asked, not instructed, not demanded, whether the guests who had been moved to those seats that morning might be willing to swap places with my parents for the remainder of the evening. I said, "Please." I meant it. Daniel's Aunt Patricia stood up before I had fully finished the sentence. She was a woman I had met exactly twice, who wore sensible shoes and had kind eyes and had, at both previous meetings, seemed faintly uncomfortable with the Hargrove family's louder frequencies. She stood and she said, clearly and without hesitation, "Of course. Of course they should be up here." She touched the arm of the person beside her. They moved. The others followed. My parents stood. My mother pressed her hand flat against her mouth, the way she does when she is trying to hold something in that wants very much to come out. My father straightened his jacket, the charcoal suit, the new shoes, and he offered my mother his arm, and they walked the full length of that hall together while the room came alive around them. Not everyone. Carolyn sat very still. Brooke looked at her phone. But enough people rose, enough hands came together, enough voices added themselves to the sound, that by the time my parents reached the front, it felt like something that had been corrected, like a sentence that had been wrong and was now right. They sat down in the seats that had always been theirs. My mother was crying without trying to hide it. My father nodded once, slowly, at nothing in particular, the way he nods when something has happened that he does not have words for but wants to mark. I said into the microphone, simply and without ceremony, "There. Now we can dance." The room answered, and we did. Carolyn called 3 days after the wedding. We were still at the honeymoon hotel, a place with white walls and ocean views and a balcony where I had been eating room service and watching the water and trying to locate, somewhere inside the exhaustion and the relief and the strange emotional aftermath of the biggest day of my life, something that felt like peace. I had almost found it. I was close. Then my phone lit up with her name, and I looked at it for a long moment before answering, already knowing, in the way you know things you have been quietly bracing for, that whatever came next was going to require something from me. She said I had humiliated her family. She said it with the particular composure of a woman who has rehearsed her grievance carefully, who has waited the minimum socially acceptable number of days before delivering it, who has framed it in the language of dignity and decorum so that the substance of what she's actually saying, that I had stepped out of line, that I had embarrassed her in front of people whose opinion she valued, that I had behaved in a way that was unacceptable to her, and that she expected me to understand why. Something that sounds almost reasonable. She used the word inappropriate. She used the word calculated. She said I had made a scene on a day that was supposed to be about love. And the way she said the word love made it clear that in her definition of it, my parents did not feature very prominently. I let her finish. My mother taught me this, not as a strategy, not as a technique, but simply as a practice of basic respect, the belief that people deserve to complete their own sentences even when those sentences are being used against you. So I held the phone and looked at the ocean, and I let Carolyn say everything she had come to say. Then I told her, quietly and without apology, that my parents had been seated near the kitchen while her family occupied the front row that had been designated for them, that I had said something about it, that if what I said felt like a scene, the scene had in fact begun earlier that day, in a decision that was made without my knowledge and at my parents' expense, and I thought it was worth being honest about where the origin of all of this actually sat. There was a silence. Then she said, "Daniel told me you'd be difficult about this." I have thought about that sentence many times in the months since. Not because it hurt me, though it did in the specific way that a sentence hurts when it confirms something you were hoping wasn't true. I have thought about it because of what it revealed. It meant that my husband, in the days between the wedding and that phone call, had spoken to his mother about me, had characterized me to her, had used a word, difficult, that was doing a very specific kind of work. It was the word you use to preemptively discredit someone before their complaint can land. It was the word that reframes a woman with legitimate grievances as a woman with a disposition problem. And it told me, with uncomfortable clarity, that even after everything that had happened in that reception hall, the private conversation Daniel was having with his family was still not the one I needed him to be having. Difficult. I sat with that word on the balcony with the ocean in front of me, and I thought about all the years I had spent being the opposite of difficult. The planning meetings I had not questioned, the decisions I had not challenged, the discomforts I had swallowed and relabeled as flexibility and called it being easy to love. I had been so committed to being easy that I had made it easy for people to treat my parents as an afterthought, and I had told myself that was the gracious choice, the mature choice, the choice of a woman who understood that marriage meant compromise. What it had actually been was disappearance, gradual and voluntary, one small accommodation at a time. The moment I stopped being easy, I became difficult. That is a thing worth knowing about the room you have been living in. Daniel and I had the hardest conversations of our marriage in the weeks that followed. Not one long conversation, but many. Some of them late at night, some of them in the car, some of them starting in the middle of something else entirely because there was no clean moment to begin and we had stopped waiting for one. I told him what the silence had cost me. Not just the wedding, not just that specific day, but the accumulated weight of every moment I had seen something wrong and said nothing because the cost of speaking felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. I told him I was not willing to keep paying that cost. I told him that being married to him could not mean being invisible to his family, and that his comfort with their behavior was not something I could continue to absorb without it changing how I felt about him. He listened. He cried, and I believed the tears were genuine because I knew him well enough to know the difference between his real emotions and his performed ones. He said things I needed to hear, that he had known his mother was difficult, that he had told himself it would be easier to manage from the inside than to confront directly, that he had convinced himself it wasn't as bad as it looked because looking at it directly meant having to do something about it. He said he was sorry in the particular way of a person who has arrived, finally and uncomfortably, at an honest accounting of themselves. I accepted the apology. I did not immediately trust it. Real change and genuine remorse are two separate things, and I had learned by then to wait and see which one showed up over time rather than taking the presence of one as evidence of the other. I am telling this from 14 months later. Here is what that time has shown me. Daniel had a direct conversation with his mother. Not a gentle suggestion, not a careful hint, but an actual conversation in which he told her plainly that her treatment of my parents was something he was no longer willing to overlook or excuse, and that his marriage required her to reckon with that, whether it was comfortable for her or not. She did not receive it well. There were 2 months of cold distance from her, pointed absences, a family dinner we were not invited to, a birthday acknowledged with a card, and nothing more. He held the line anyway. That was new. That was the thing I had not seen from him before and needed to see, and when it came, I let it matter to me. Carolyn is still Carolyn. I want to be honest about that because stories like this one can end in transformations that real life rarely delivers. She did not have a revelation. She did not apologize to my parents directly, not in words, though she did at a family gathering 6 months ago cross the room to speak to my mother unprompted, called her by her name, asked about her health, stayed in the conversation for 10 full minutes. My mother told me about it on the phone that evening, trying to sound neutral and almost succeeding. My father said, "That's a start." He has always been better at starts than I am. What changed most, and most permanently, was not Carolyn. It was me. I used to believe that keeping peace was the same as keeping love, that the two things were so close together as to be nearly identical, and that a woman who made herself small enough and quiet enough and accommodating enough was practicing a kind of love that would eventually be recognized and returned. I carried that belief through 2 years of a relationship and into a marriage, and it cost me, and it cost my parents, in ways I am still adding up. I picked up a microphone at my wedding and said something true. I said it in front of 300 people and a room full of candles and a mother-in-law whose smile went tight as I spoke, and I did not apologize for saying it. Not that night. Not in the days that followed. Not once. My parents walked to the front of the room in their careful clothes and their quiet dignity, and they sat in the seats that had always been theirs, and my mother cried without hiding it, and my father nodded in that slow and wordless way of his. I think about that walk often. The length of the hall, the candles, the sound of people making room. That is what I want to carry from that day. Not the flowers, not the dress, not even the vows, which were true and which I meant. What I want to carry is the moment I stopped negotiating with my own silence, the moment I understood that my voice was not a disruption, that using it was not a failure of grace or gratitude or love, but the fullest expression of all three. I grabbed the mic. I said what was true. And everything that has been worth keeping came after that.